I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guest today on the show is Ian Cinnamon. Ian is the CEO and co-founder of Apex, a space startup based in Los Angeles that focuses on the manufacturing and scaling of satellite buses. Throughout this conversation, we discussed the current state of the space economy, the role that national security plays in the conversation here, and of course, the evolving nature of the space technology space as we move beyond just simply reducing the cost of launch and focus on the deployment of satellite assets via the satellite buses that Apex specializes in.
You might have a commercial company that's focused on imaging the Earth and they want to do it to measure climate change. Well, any smart government is going to say, I want all the data I can because I want to observe my borders, I want to observe troop movements, whatever it may be. It is very difficult to find any asset in space that a government, whether it be US, allied nations, non-allied nations, whatever it may be, does not touch some part of that value chain.
Hope you all enjoy this conversation. Ian Cinnamon, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Marshall, thanks so much for having me.
This is around our third or fourth episode that's focused on space. So at this point, we don't have to spend 5 to 10 minutes kind of going through the Elon story in terms of the general audience story. Launch was expensive, SpaceX comes, it reduces the cost of launch in service of this broader mission of going to Mars, blah, 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 blah. Folks know this story at this point. I would, though, love to hear your articulation as a founder of where the story actually is today. Let's take the 2000s and 2010s for granted. Where should we pick things up from now and to start moving forward?
It's a great question, Marshall. So the way that we see the industry is, as you mentioned, costs are coming down, more and more vehicles are going to orbit. I always look at it from a systems basis, right? You say, okay, like it's great that SpaceX has done phenomenal things. Companies like Rocket Lab and others have gotten us to get to orbit more easily, but that's only part of the equation, right? If you want to have a business that operates in space, let's say you are a commercial company that's doing Earth observation, you're providing communications, you're a government, US government, allied nation, non-allied nations, whoever it may be, you want assets in space, it's not just about the launch. You also have to think about everything from what are you actually launching into orbit, the satellites themselves, you have to think about the ground side, the technology that intersects the two, all of that. For us, what we noticed really starting about 3 or 4 years ago was as launch became more and more ubiquitous, the challenge in the system shifted from the launch side really towards the side of, well, what are you actually putting on all those rockets? And specifically, those are satellites, right? A satellite is anything that's up in orbit and it's human-made, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that I found fascinating was if you look at kind of the overall landscape of all the satellites going into space, there's a core part of every single satellite that tends to be the most common source of frustration for people launching things to orbit. And that is what we call in the industry the satellite bus platform. And that is pretty much the core set of components on a satellite that are not the payload. So the payload might be the camera, the sensor, the communications dish, whatever it may be. Everything else, the physical structure, the solar panels, propulsion system, that is the bus. And we noticed that that was a major cause for delay in the industry. Not because someone had done something wrong or, the tech wasn't there, simply because all of this money and effort had gone into the launch side. But as that was becoming more and more solved, people were like, wait a minute, we need to now put money into the satellite side to actually get those to orbit more quickly. And that's really where I came into the picture and Apex came into the picture.
Yeah, tell us a little more about Apex, just to introduce things.
Yes, so at Apex, we like to say we solve today's largest challenge in the space economy, which is the satellite bus platform, exactly what I was talking about. So satellite buses, satellite platforms, nothing new, right? Since the beginning of the space era, right? Decades and decades ago, if you want to put a satellite in orbit, you need the satellite platform or the satellite bus. However, typically for the last, 50, 60 years, every time there's a new satellite that needs to go to orbit, it's typical in this industry to say, let us design a brand new bus for a given payload. And frankly, if you were, launching your satellites to space, twice a year, maybe once every couple of years, you have plenty of time to go redesign that satellite bus from scratch every single time. You probably have enough money to do that because the cost to get to orbit's super expensive. But in today's era, people are trying to get more and more of their payloads to orbit significantly faster. And as a result of that, the bottleneck's on the bus side. So at Apex, what we say is, hey, instead of building a brand new, bespoke, non-recurring engineering, all this great expense into engineering services to design a brand new bus, what if we treated satellite buses like a true product? Where we said we're going to design it ahead of time, have our engineers go build it, and our production team is going to go manufacture a bunch of them. And what that means is you have a payload you want to get to orbit, we're not going to go custom design a bus for you, but we probably have a bus that happens to fit your payload. And is it going to be, the perfect fit? No, but is it going to work? Yes. And the analogy that I like to make is it's almost more like buying a car. Let's say, you have, 3 people that you need to drive somewhere and you need 3 bicycles and you want to bring your dog. You're not going to go to Toyota and say, make me a car that's perfect for this. You're going to go buy an SUV and it's going to do the job for you. We think about satellite buses the same way. And frankly, it's a little bit new in this industry, but I think it's something that the industry is very much ready for.
Help me understand the limits of the bus metaphor, because I'm imagining a world where maybe, and this is probably be totally incorrect, so please guest check me on this one. But let's say you have a satellite bus. Are there like 5 to 10 satellites, maybe from maybe even different companies or different payload sets that are just being launched into space, and part of your job here is like deploying them throughout like the actual ecosystem? Like, how should we think about what's actually technically happening here?
Yes. It's a very good point, right? And if I were to tell me if I'm misinterpreting this, but the way that I see it is there's a large number of different missions that people are trying to do in orbit, right? So if we were to rewind, 30 years, there might have been 5, right? We might want some spy satellites, right? We might want a couple communication satellites. Like you have a very limited set of use cases. In today's world, that set of use cases has expanded massively. Just on like, hey, I want to take photos of the Earth, it's no longer that simple. It's now, do I want to take photos of the Earth, in electro-optical, like a normal camera? Do I want to use hyperspectral imaging? Do I want to use infrared? Do I want to use LiDAR? There's all these different ways now to take photos of the Earth. So even within the one mission set of take photos, you might have 10 or 15 different specific submissions within there that you need to build for. Communication, same thing. Are you trying to, offer basically a very high bandwidth, communications line for data, like for internet? That's very different than if you want something for IoT, right? So there's all these different mission sets. And that doesn't even start to get into where it gets, in my opinion, even more fascinating, which is the world of things like NASA experiments in space or, in-space manufacturing, things like that. So today's world, I would argue there's hundreds of different use cases or specific mission sets for that, require buses. And the laws of physics dictate that you cannot have a single satellite bus that works for every use case. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a specific example, right? If you design a satellite bus that is, has a tremendous amount of power. So you have a huge array of solar panels, you're giving a ton of power to that payload. And you want that satellite bus to remain super steady so you could take photographs of the Earth. The very nature of the laws of physics mean you need these huge attitude determination control systems, reaction wheels to be able to stabilize that platform. That inherently drives up the cost. So if you want something that complex, it's going to be a more expensive product just by the nature of the hardware, versus if you want something that maybe doesn't need that precision pointing, you can get away with a very different system. And our solution there is I go back to my car analogy, right? We do not believe in going and manufacturing 1,000 different products because then you lose the product nature. What we believe in is this idea of having a few models of satellites that are physically different sizes, right? In the industry, you call it ESPA, ESPA Grande, and then you go from there. So I think small, medium, large. And similarly, within each of those models, we have what we call configuration packages. So you could go online and you could say, hey, I want a small satellite that, and small for us is about the size of a refrigerator, but I want a small one with high power. I don't need precision pointing. I don't need NSA encryption. And you could actually go and customize it. And what that leads to is dozens and dozens of different permutations without us having to re-engineer it. Just like a car company, right? You go to the Toyota dealership, there's 1,000 different cars on the lot. No two are the same, but they're all Toyota Corollas.
Something I'm curious about, I'd love for you to kind of place the space startup ecosystem within a broader spectrum of spaces folks have probably heard about. So in many ways, this is very much a deep tech industry. You are a deep tech company. In other ways, there are clearly dual use implications for everything we're talking about here in the national security category. And we're also in this moment where defense tech as a category has gotten a lot of attention. Where does a space startup that's heavy on the manufacturing side fit into all of these different worlds as you're trying to explain and articulate to non-experts, but who have policy problems and policy orientations they need to think about your work? How do you really explain where this fits in everything?
So at Apex, one of the core things that we pride ourselves on is we do not like to think of ourselves as having technology risk. And the reason that I say that is, again, satellite bus platforms have been around for decades. Right? We're not inventing some crazy new science experiment. We're not doing something that might not work. We know what we're doing. The thing that we're really bringing to satellite bus platforms is this idea of manufacturing at scale, design for manufacturing approaches, software first principles, et cetera. What I actually look at when I think of policymakers and kind of this landscape is this idea that in today's market, as a taxpayer, you're a taxpayer, right? And I'm sure many of your listeners are taxpayers in the US. What I notice is all of this money obviously goes in to fund more and more space programs, as it should, because that is it's the ultimate high ground. It's one of the most valuable assets you can imagine. That being said, if you look at the speed in which both commercial and government entities are able to get satellites to orbit, it's not quick. You're talking in the order of years. You're also looking at the cost of getting it to orbit. And what you notice is that if you're redesigning the satellite bus every time, you're no longer spending, $3, $4, $5 million on a satellite bus. You're spending $20, $30, $40, $50 million on a satellite bus when you could just reuse the one from before. So our whole philosophy here is that we want to be in a situation where we're able to provide a true product and not charge the taxpayer, not charge commercial companies for that non-recurring engineering, and frankly, save everybody money and get more assets to orbit more quickly.
I like the distinction between within the deep tech category, it's not as if you're inventing something fundamentally new. It's that you're working within a process and then taking innovations from outside spaces into that process. So that raises the ultimate question, though, which I'm sure you ran into during your pitching slide deck period. Why haven't existing incumbents taken this process to its logical conclusion? If you're already building these buses, why wouldn't you just say, okay, let's focus now on scale? Because to your point, you transitioned from this area when the question was just sort of launch to actually now it's about volume and getting it into actual space in the first place.
The quickest way to answer that is a simple phrase, which is incentive structures. It's inherent in the system to encourage non-recurring engineering, to encourage going and rebuilding it every single time. And that is kind of a bold statement. It's a lot to say, so I can peel it back a little bit and explain it a little bit more.
That's fascinating.
Fundamentally, up until 3 or 4 years ago, you had to do bespoke new engineering every time. So this is really a recent problem, right? It's only because the cost of launch has come down, we're no longer as mass constrained, we're more volume constrained. It's a whole different situation where effectively we're not needing to hyper-optimize the bus platform. Now, you may say, well, 3 or 4 years ago, that's a long time, right? Why have people not adapted and said, we're going to avoid the non-recurring engineering, we're going to go do all of that? And the easiest way to answer this question is to look at the purchasers of satellite buses and satellite systems. And many of them are on the government or the commercial side, right? It's a dual-use environment, two types of end customers. And both of those end customers have traditionally been ready to spend money on non-recurring engineering to build something that's custom for them. And if you were to go to a large company and you said, hey, look, my budget for a satellite bus is $100 million because I know that you're going to have to redesign it from scratch and that'll cost you at least $50 million in NRE, so go for it. What company in their right mind is going to be incentivized to say, you know what, it's okay. I'm going to reuse a prior design. You only need to charge me 50. And the reason that they're so incentivized to want as much money as possible is many of these contracts, even on the commercial side, are effectively cost-plus contracts, where you're in a situation where you're employing brilliant engineers who are, have really pushed this field forward, but they need to keep winning more and more contracts. They want to keep inventing new satellite buses because, frankly, engineering is fun, right? Who doesn't want to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch and design a new, beautiful, exquisite system? But the reality is that's no longer really needed. And it takes a fresh company coming in who has raised extensive venture capital funding to be able to take a step back and say, I'm going to use my VC funding to create a true product. I'm not going to charge you non-recurring engineering for it. And if you ask me to do non-recurring engineering, I will politely decline and really offer it as a true product.
So over the past year or so, you've been physically building buses in your factory. Manufacturing is obviously on a couple of different levels, both civilian and defense related, just the hot thing that everyone's focused on right now. What have been your takeaways, lessons, interesting tidbits that are going to apply beyond just the work that y'all are doing with Apex?
Wow, very good question. So I will say I live and breathe Apex, so everything is usually through that lens. But if I can extrapolate out and take a step back for a second, what I would say is, just because somebody in some industry, right, whether it be manufacturing or deep tech or space or not space at all, has been doing the same thing for years or decades, does not mean that they're not open to something new. And I think a lot of people have the instinct of saying, wow, take satellite buses, right? People have been buying them the same way. They're spending NRE. They want something custom. It's easy to instinctively say, oh, they're always going to want something custom. But if you really go spend the time and talk to those customers and understand it, you can really drill down into what their actual pain points are and figure out, okay, can we go solve something? Mm-hmm. The second thing that I will say I think is a good takeaway here is I really believe that a real company needs to have a clear path to revenue and profitability fairly early on in the process. So I think for not just, within the world of space, but if you take a step back and you look at deep tech as a whole, the number of companies in the deep tech sector that are frankly science projects and should be funded out of, university, out of grants, et cetera, who are raising venture capital money, I get very nervous for them and for the overall industry because I know that there are years away from having something where they could actually commercialize it and make money off of it. So for us, we believe not in, taking venture money and, fingers crossed, let's go spend it all, let's go do this. We believe in creating a business with fundamentally real unit economics that can scale over time. And that has been a lesson that I have learned just going through this entire process, that even as you work with customers on the government side, on the prime side, et cetera, they want to know that you have a laser focus on creating something that is sustainable and will really be an enduring company.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you framed the deep tech venture funding versus science project debate, because I was recently speaking to a influential person who engages in the national security space, White House veteran. We had this whole conversation. At the end, she was like, wait, what's deep tech? So I now know as a host that we could just sort of do our inside baseball thing. Could you actually articulate what deep tech as a field, what it actually is, and then make clear what you meant, because I understood what you were saying, but maybe other people don't, between the science project versus actual serious, not because it's all serious, let's be good faith, but explain the inside baseball, what you were getting at there.
So defining deep tech is not easy. I'm happy to give it a shot on the fly, but I need your feedback on it.
Yeah, this is not the official authoritative take, but when
this is just Ian's hot take.
Yeah, Ian's hot take. Yeah, what is the?
So the way in my mental model for deep tech is it has to involve hardware, right? That is fundamental, right? I think it's very hard to do deep tech purely on the software level, and I also think deep tech is something where it is traditionally not a mass market consumer device. I do not typically think of that as deep tech, right? I think it's something where you are effectively touching hardware, you're building something new, and you're building it for a customer, and the customer is typically an enterprise customer, a government, something like that. That is my very loose definition. I have no doubt that the listeners on this podcast or you could probably point out 200 companies that break my definition, that are clearly deep tech, and I'm way off base. But that's my on-the-fly definition. I think the key thing that you asked is the distinction between science project and real company. And what I would say is there's a lot of amazing entrepreneurs, a lot of amazing thinkers who have big, bold ideas, and those people should feel empowered. But those people should feel empowered to validate whether the science behind their idea works, to validate whether there's a business model there. And I personally, as somebody who occasionally will angel invest in companies and I help out a lot of different investors, vetting things, et cetera, would much prefer to see those companies use resources that are not venture capital dollars to validate the science, right? If you have a theory for, I don't know, a new superconducting material, instead of raising venture capital money to do a lot of research and then, okay, maybe you invent it new and now it's some new tech and then maybe now you have to figure out how to monetize it. I think there's already great mechanisms in the US and globally to push forward that kind of scientific research, right? Things like government grants, research labs in universities, research labs in not universities, but just research institutions, of which there are many, that are able to push this forward in a way where tax dollars are kind of used more effectively. And then that IP is out there. That founder, that inventor, whatever it may be, should then go take that technology, and when they're ready to actually turn it into a real business. And what I mean by a real business is if I put $1 in, I expect more than $1 to come out of it on a timescale that is short, right? If I put $1 in today and you tell me, hey, Ian, great news. In 10 years, there's a 1% chance that the science experiment works out and I'll give you $100 back. That's not a good bet for anybody. Like, I don't think investors should be focused on that. Investors should be focused on what is a technology that has been validated or is close enough to being validated that it's not a super lengthy experiment before we get there, that we can go ahead and make a return on. And I think the investors that focus on that and do that are going to have outsized returns in this deep tech or space industry or hardware, whatever you want to call it.
And I'd actually love to hear then, given the fact that you've clearly put a lot of thought into this, what is your mental model for how the United States then as a whole advances from a technological innovation perspective? Because on the one hand, and this kind of happens a little bit when you speak too loosely about venture and deep tech investment, when you're sort of saying like, we're creating all this and we're spending all this money on these companies, but like to your point, that's a little separate from the innovation and science question. You could speak from your own perspective, but I'm curious, like, how then do you fit then the venture model within how we just innovate in general, which is a big question for this century, obviously.
So my mental model, and again, I could be totally off base here, but the way I see it is there's two parts to actually innovating. So one is there's some new technology that's out there, and that I think usually will not come out of a startup, right? Look, a startup might invent some new algorithm or maybe some new technology. But if they're saying, I want to work like a research lab, I would argue a research lab out of again, whether it be a university or a research institution or something that's kind of has the real rigor of a research institution is going to be phenomenal at producing that new innovation, that new IP, whatever it may be. The gap between having some new invention and actually delivering it to the market where it could be useful all comes down to what I call execution. And I would argue that is the hardest part. It's what is the business model? How do we recruit the team? How do we build it at scale? How do we do it in a way that people actually want it? And the reason that I say that is the hard part is, one, that's what we're focused here on Apex, so it feels good to say that. But in reality, go to any research lab around the country, right? You could go to ones that are like SRI, you go to universities, you go to all these different ones. They have a amazing patent portfolio, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of amazing inventions and patents that are frankly just sitting there on the shelf. And you may say, why have these not turned into companies? And the reason is the people who have invented them, who have come up with this technology, are typically not the ones who are amazing in execution. And there's always people who are great at both. But I think by and large, there's a difference between somebody who really wants to focus on kind of the scientific technical rigor of inventing something new and somebody who could go take that and turn that into a business that is actually able to get out there in the world. And look, if you're able to do both, all the power to you, that's amazing. But what I would just say is I think there's so many inventions that are out there that need to be turned into actual businesses and put to use. I would rather see people raising money to do that as opposed to doing research that frankly might already have been done before, is in progress already, where we could just combine efforts and get that to market faster.
One of the themes of post-COVID venture and entrepreneurship is this idea that obviously a lot of folks, especially in the AI space, are coming back to the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, but you could also go other places too. You're in Los Angeles with your factory, but my inner Texan coming to you from Austin needs to ask you, why are you in California versus other locales? We actually first met like when you were in Miami. Varda is out in Miami and LA. So just help people understand like the geographic ecosystem of the space economy.
I will have a slightly, I think, contrarian opinion here, which is I think you could build a space company pretty much anywhere in the world. If you have a great idea, you have traction, you have the right people, you can attract people truly anywhere. I've seen phenomenal companies, not just space companies, but hardware companies, deep tech companies, whatever we want to call it, literally built everywhere from major kind of cities like Austin or LA, all the way to kind of smaller locations like Goleta or Santa Barbara, or, kind of internationally, middle of the country, wherever it may be. So I would argue that if you have the right concentration of talent and ideas and execution, you can really recruit people pretty much anywhere. That being said, I'll make a plug for Los Angeles because I am a big fan of LA. It's not just because I grew up here. The space industry, I would argue, really did start here. You can see the beginning of many of the defense companies up and down the coast of Los Angeles. If you ever want to drive from LA down to San Diego, you're pretty much going to pass every major defense prime, right? You're going to pass, Northrop, Lockheed, Boeing, you name it, right? You just drive down and you see every defense prime you've ever heard of and their big buildings and their headquarters, whatever it may be. And they've been here from the beginning. As that has evolved, there's been different waves of startups that have come out of there, right? I think there was a prior wave that led a lot of employees from these defense primes to joining companies like SpaceX, Rocket Lab, Relativity. There's been more recent waves where they've joined amazing newer companies like Anduril and now companies like Apex, et cetera. So that concentration of not just talent, but people who are mission-oriented and want to build systems that are key for the U.S. government, allied nations, critical infrastructure, commercial companies, et cetera. There's just a strong concentration here. That being said, there's also a strong concentration in cities like Austin, D.C., Colorado, like throughout Colorado Springs, Denver, et cetera. So I have to say, as much as I love Los Angeles, I am not one of those people who say, you must build your company here, here, here. I think LA is frankly the best place to do it. But hey, if you have the right team, the right idea, and the right traction, you can build a company anywhere. Except for remote. I do not believe in remote work.
Which is especially difficult when you're focused on hardware specifically. But as I'm recording this from Austin, we do very much believe in remote podcasting. So I need to keep that editorially within this conversation point outside of media. So, okay, so last two questions here. So I think we've done a great job of giving an overview of the space economy, where the space is developed, where Apex comes into things. I think most folks here are coming to this from a national security perspective. So take this question anywhere you basically want to take it. To what degree is the space satellite bus space dual use? What are the national security conversations you made reference to, like allied governments potentially being customers? How do you think about all that?
So if you look at where the money flows in the space industry, it is very difficult to find any asset in space that a government, whether it be U.S., allied nations, non-allied nations, whatever it may be, does not touch some part of that value chain. And what I mean by that is you might have a commercial company that's focused on imaging the Earth and they want to do it to measure climate change. Well, any smart government is going to say, I want all the data I can because I want to observe my borders. I want to observe troop movements, whatever it may be. There's actually, I don't know, Marshall, if you've seen this, but Ashley Vance released a new film on HBO.
Yes.
A documentary on kind of Planet Labs, Astra, and Rocket Lab. And I thought it actually captured the stories incredibly well. We know all of those folks very, very well. But I think one of the ones that really directly answers your question is look at Planet, right? They began very focused not on government at all, right? They want to measure climate change, help commercial companies. And the reality of the situation is, well, you could do that and you could help government. You could do everything. So what I would say is every aspect of space touches government one way or another. That being said, there's some parts of space that are purely government, classified missions, programs directly to that, to allied nations, et cetera, that are only going to be serving government. But every aspect of commercial, even kind of traditional like geocom operators, there's a good chunk of their business that comes from the government side that's using that spectrum, that's using that bandwidth.
So, and for the last and final question here, bear with me for a second if you don't follow this metaphor in your day-to-day life. So this podcast is titled Arsenal of Democracy. And for a lot of folks, when they're thinking through what we're obviously referencing, that pre-war, post-war, and then, of course, World War II era, where so much of American industry actually converted to a munitions and national interest level of perspective. A lot of folks tend to colloquially basically just sort of say, in the 40s, we had the auto industry. Today, we have the tech industry. And the part where the metaphor breaks down at a literal level, I know it's having worked with a lot of founders like you in the past, is if you were a line manager at a GM plant in the 1930s, changing from cars to tanks is just like very literal. One is civilian, one is military, but obviously it's the same basic idea. So when we talk today about Silicon Valley founders and how the fact that at the end of the day, the United States has this talent of ambitious, business-oriented, mission-driven folks, I'd be curious as a founder who very much started in like, let's just say the most like civilian-y, the most like 2010s, we're building apps, we're building software part of things. So transitioning into deep hardware, I'd love for you just to reflect upon like what does and what doesn't translate when you're thinking about applying your actual talent and your focus area from, once again, not vapid, not silly, deeply important, this is the way the economy works, but from this civilian to this more, let's say, national interest and defense-related category. We'd love to hear your closing thoughts on that.
There's two ways that I think about this. And there's one way that is a little bit more focused on, there's the lessons from, let's call it, early 2010 Silicon Valley and how that applies to today's world. And there's another part of it that frankly is just, I feel like, growing up and having a better sense of the world and the impact that one could have on the world. So I'll start with that one because I think that's probably, more directly relevant here. But coming out of college and being kind of new on the market and seeing the art of the possible in startup land, it's inspiring. You see these people with an idea, they put something out there, they get all this traction, there's momentum, there's, this immediate feedback loop, this endorphin rush that you get every day. But as you start to see more and more hit the market, I think something that is often asked is, okay, great, like, what impact are you having? Like, what dent have you made in the world? What dent do you want to make in the world? And I've been very fortunate to work with some, amazing bosses of mine, to work with coworkers who are incredible, et cetera. And one thing that I see, no matter how successful people are, whether they've taken companies public or they've had failures, whatever it may be, is they constantly go back to saying, okay, great, like, what impact is my product having? Mm-hmm. And the more that you think about that, I think the more that you start to connect the dots to saying, wow, how incredible would it be if I can make something that actually pushed the world forward. And that doesn't necessarily mean deep tech by any means, right? I think there's things on education, right? There's things all over the map, like even games, how they connect people, like the social aspect is incredible. And almost whether you're fully leaning in and saying, I want to supply things to the military, or whether you're saying, I just want to make life on Earth better for people, whatever it may be, I think having that mindset of how can I have that impact becomes more and more prevalent as you see more, you do more, and so on, at least for me. On the product side, though, I will say there's a lot of great lessons that kind of the traditional 2010s world of Silicon Valley teaches, and that really is kind of this product-first nature of like the product is key. It's not about the tech, it's about the product. And if people use the product, then great, it kind of sells itself. And if they don't, you're doing something wrong. And what I will say is when I first entered the world of US government work and the space industry and satellite buses, what I noticed is there's no such thing as a real product. Like that was a foreign concept. So one of the things that I've been very excited about is can I tie kind of that older Silicon Valley kind of product first nature to this world of aerospace and actually be a product first company here.
That is a perfect way to end to tie everything together. Ian, this has been really great. Y'all are moving fast. You have a lot of different resources. You've got a great media kit on the website. Where are some places that folks should go to learn more about Apex and what y'all are doing?
Yes. So the best place to go to learn more is to apply for a job here. We are hiring and we have amazing roles in every kind of group within the company. So I would say, sure, you could go read about us online, but I'd much rather interview you for a role if you are, if what I'm talking about now is something that excites you.
Awesome. Perfect place to end. We'll, of course, include a link in the show notes. Ian, thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.